Get down and scrub my shoes. Arthur Sterling said it flat, no rush, like he was ordering coffee. In a ballroom smelling of roses and money, Maya Vance stood still. She wore a $7 thrift store dress. Arthur wore a $12,000 suit tailored in Milan. Slowly, he threw a $10,000 check at her feet. It landed face up on the cold marble floor. 140 guests froze. Champagne glasses stopped halfway to open mouths. Nobody said a word. Maya didn't move to pick it up. She adjusted her scratched old watch instead, stared at him silent. He had no idea whose daughter he'd just called a stray dog. Not from a stranger. From the man who ruled every room he ever walked into, not even close. Have you ever been judged worthless by a stranger in front of a room full of strangers who never once asked your name? Now let me take you back to the moment before that check ever hit the floor.
No one expected a disguised heiress to be humiliated. The billionaire targeted the absolute wrong woman. Let's rewind.
Arthur Sterling's voice hit the marble floor before the check did. Get down and scrub my shoes. He said it flat, no rush, like a man ordering coffee. You're a stray dog that wandered into my house. In my house, dogs kneel when their master speaks. The check landed face up. $10,000 folded once, already curling at the corner from his grip. 140 guests stood frozen around the ballroom champagne flutes halfway to their mouths. Nobody breathed. Maya Vance did not kneel. She looked down at the check. She looked back up at him. Her hand moved once slow and adjusted the worn leather strap at her wrist. Not fear, not defiance, just a small private gesture, the kind you make out of habit, not out of need to be watched. Man, he really picked the wrong woman to test tonight. Julianne stood by the dessert table, clipboard pressed against her stomach, watching the whole thing unfold with her eyes cast down. She had seen Arthur Sterling humiliate valets, humiliate waitstaff, humiliate his own son. She had never seen anyone absorb it like this. No trembling lip, no apology. Just stillness, the kind that has weight, the kind that presses on a room instead of shrinking from it. 3 hours earlier, the ballroom of the Grand Vance Hotel had smelled like roses and old money, hundreds of white blooms flown in that morning, each one costing more than Maya's monthly rent. String music drifted low under the chandeliers. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne that caught the light and threw it back gold. Maya had worn the same navy dress she'd worn to 3 other Sterling family functions. Thrift store, $7, the tag, long gone. She knew what the dress said to a room like this. She had stopped caring what it said years ago. Arthur Sterling noticed anyway. He crossed the ballroom in his charcoal suit, the fabric so dark it looked wet under the light, and stopped in front of her with a smile built for cameras. "Well, woo," he said. "Look what wandered in off the street." A few guests near him laughed quick and nervous, the kind of laugh that exists to protect the laugher, not to express joy. Garrett Sterling, standing 3 feet away in his pristine tuxedo, said nothing. He looked at the floor. He looked at his father. He looked at the floor again. Julianne watched Garrett's jaw tighten and then go slack. She recognized the shape of a man deciding not to fight. "Do you know what this dress costs?" Arthur asked the room, gesturing at his own suit, not waiting for an answer. $12,000. $12,000 tailored in Milan. He turned back to Maya. "And you show up to my son's engagement dinner looking like you raided a church donation bin." Silence answered him first, then low, a few more laughs, thinner this time. Maya's expression did not change. Her eyes, dead calm, tracked him the way a person tracks weather, not with alarm, just with attention. She reached up and touched the watch on her wrist again, an old thing scratched crystal, a strap gone soft with age. Arthur saw the gesture and misread it completely. Is that supposed to impress someone? He reached for her wrist before she could pull it back, turning it toward the light like an appraiser handling a fake. This is a $5 drugstore watch, cheap, plastic. Just like everything else about you, it was not plastic. It was a 1962 Patek Philippe hand wound given to her by a man who had never once raised his voice at her in her entire life. She did not correct him. She simply took her wrist back, slow, deliberate, and said nothing at all. Not a flinch, not a word, just distance. That was the moment Arthur decided silence meant weakness. "Nothing to say?" His voice climbed a register, performing now for the guests who had gathered in a loose half-circle drawn by the smell of a public execution. "Speechless because you know it's true. You know your place, don't you?" He said the phrase slow, savoring it like a compliment he was giving himself. "That's actually admirable. Knowing your place. Know your place. Hold on to that. You're going to hear it again." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a checkbook already signed, and tore the top check free with a flourish practiced for exactly this kind of audience. He held it up between two fingers. $10,000, he announced loud enough to reach the back tables. To buy a real dress. Or, better yet, to simply disappear from my son's life before you embarrass this family any further. He dropped it. It fell slow, spiraling once before it hit the marble at Maya's feet. Rose stems, champagne bubbles. 140 guests frozen mid-breath, watching a folded piece of paper land like a verdict. Maya looked at the check. She did not move to pick it up. Julianne's knuckles went white around her clipboard. She had watched Arthur Sterling do cruel things to people who couldn't afford to lose their jobs. She had never watched him do it to someone who simply refused to react. "Pick it up," Arthur said, quieter now, an edge creeping under the polish.
Or are you too proud to take money from a man who built an empire out of nothing?
Maya finally spoke. Her voice was even, unhurried, barely above the murmur of the string quartet still playing somewhere behind them. "I don't need your money, Mr. Sterling." 4 words followed, spaced like stones dropped into still water. "I never did." The room did not laugh this time. Arthur's smile thinned at the edges, the first real crack in 3 hours of performance. He was not used to being told no by anyone wearing a $7 dress, and something about her calm, her total refusal to bend, needled at him in a way he couldn't name and wasn't about to examine. Garrett Sterling still hadn't moved. His eyes stayed on the floor, on the check, on anything that wasn't Maya's face. She wasn't looking at Garrett anymore anyway. She was looking at Arthur, steady, unblinking, the way a small animal watches a predator that hasn't yet decided whether it's hungry. Not because she was brave, not because she had some plan already forming behind her eyes, just because that's who she was and nothing about tonight had changed it. Arthur laughed, then short and sharp, and turned to the crowd as if her silence had proven his point instead of denying it. He didn't see Julianne's hand tighten further around the clipboard. He didn't see the flicker of something unreadable cross her face, something closer to shame than amusement. He had won. He was certain of it. He had no idea that the woman standing in front of him, watched scratched, dressed, cheap voice flat, was about to become the most expensive mistake of his entire life. The music kept playing. Somewhere behind the frozen crowd, a violinist kept time as if nothing had happened, as if a check hadn't just spiraled to the floor between 2 people who used to plan a wedding together. Maya turned from Arthur. She looked at Garrett. He stood exactly where he'd been standing for the last 10 minutes, tuxedo-pressed shoes polished to a mirror shine, hands loose at his sides like a man waiting for a photograph he hadn't agreed to be in. 6 feet away, close enough to touch her, far enough that he hadn't moved once. Not toward her, not toward his father. Nowhere. Julianne watched from beside the dessert table clipboard still pressed to her stomach and felt something twist low in her chest. She had catered 9 of the Sterling family's private events. She had memorized every silence in this family, the kind that filled a room like smoke, the kind everyone breathed without commenting on. This one was different. This one had a shape she recognized from somewhere else, somewhere older, a shape that looked exactly like abandonment. Maya held Garrett's gaze and waited. She wasn't asking him to fight his father. She wasn't asking for an apology on her behalf or a scene or anything loud. She was asking for one sentence. One. A single line that said, "This woman matters to me," said in front of the room that had just watched her get called a stray dog. 3 seconds passed, then 5, then 10. Garrett's jaw worked once like he might actually say something and then went still again. His eyes dropped to the marble floor to the check lying face up between Maya's shoes to anything that wasn't the woman he'd asked to marry him 14 months ago in a rented rowboat on a lake neither of them could afford to visit twice. He looked away. Not a flinch. A choice. Julianne's stomach dropped the way it does on the first hill of a roller coaster sudden physical, no warning. She had watched a lot of cowardice in this family. She had never watched it happen this cleanly, this fast, over something that should have taken half a second to decide. Arthur's laugh cut through the quiet like a struck match. "See," he said, gesturing at his son with an open palm, presenting him to the crowd like evidence. "Even Garrett knows I'm right. Silence is agreement, sweetheart." Garrett said nothing. That was the answer. That had always been the answer. Maya felt something settle in her chest. Quiet, almost peaceful, the opposite of what a person is supposed to feel in a moment like this. Grief doesn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it arrives like a door closing softly in another room, a sound you only notice once the house has gone completely still. She had known Garrett Sterling for 3 years. She had watched him laugh at his father's jokes at family dinners, watched him wince and stay seated, watched him apologize for things that weren't his fault, just to keep the peace in a house that never offered him any. She had told herself more than once that a man raised inside a cage sometimes forgets there's a door. Tonight she stopped telling herself that, not because she had to, just because it had stopped being true the moment he looked at the floor instead of at her. Julianne's hand tightened around her clipboard until the metal edge bit into her palm. She thought about the folder sitting in Arthur Sterling's office, safe 3 floors up behind a Renoir print he'd bought at auction for $800,000, and never once looked at twice. She thought about the numbers inside that folder. She thought about how easy it would be to keep her mouth shut the way she'd kept it shut for 6 years, the way everyone in this building kept theirs shut. She didn't know yet that she wouldn't be able to keep it shut much longer. The string quartet shifted into something slower. A waiter circled with a tray of champagne, offering it to guests who accepted without meeting each other's eyes. Nobody wanted to be the one caught watching too closely. Nobody wanted to be next. Maya bent down, not for the check. She stepped over it entirely, the paper still curled and damp from the champagne someone had spilled near it, and reached instead for the small clutch she'd set on a nearby chair. Her movements were unhurried, economical, the movements of a woman who had already decided something and didn't need an audience to confirm it. "Maya," Garrett finally spoke, his voice thin, cracking slightly on the second syllable. "Can we talk about this later, please? Not here." She turned to look at him one more time. Her face gave nothing away, no tears, no trembling. Just that same dead calm gaze she'd worn since Arthur's hand first closed around her wrist. "There's nothing to talk about," she said. 5 words, no more. "You already told me everything I needed to know." Garrett flinched like she'd struck him, which was strange because she hadn't raised her voice at all. Arthur clapped his hands together, once sharp, delighted, treating the entire unraveling engagement like the final act of a show he'd personally directed. "Well," he said, "that settles that. Garrett, darling, you'll thank me for this in a year." Garrett didn't answer his father either. Not because he'd finally found his spine, because he had nothing left to say to anyone in the room, including himself. Julianne watched the ring catch the light as Maya slipped it off her finger. Small, understated, nothing like the diamonds glittering on the other women in the ballroom. Maya set it gently on the chair where her clutch had been. No drama, no toss, no scene, and walked toward the exit without looking back once. She had no idea what Arthur Sterling kept locked in that safe upstairs. She had no idea it would matter in less than 48 hours. Julianne watched the girl disappear through the ballroom doors and felt the folder in that safe grow heavier by the second 3 floors up waiting. Arthur Sterling left the ballroom without looking back. He didn't check on Garrett. He didn't check on the ruined engagement now scattered across the marble floor like confetti no one wanted to sweep up. He walked straight toward the private elevator at the far end of the lobby, phone already pressed to his ear, voice dropping into a register the party guests never got to hear. "Get me the Kessler numbers," he said. "Now." "Not in 10 minutes." Julianne followed 2 steps behind clipboard, traded now for a leather folio thick with paper she'd spent the last 6 weeks preparing. Her heels clicked against the marble in a rhythm too fast to be casual. She kept her eyes forward, her face arranged into the same practiced neutrality she wore for every crisis in this building. The elevator doors closed. The party noise vanished behind them, replaced by the low electric hum of ascending steel. Arthur exhaled once the doors sealed shut and something in his shoulders dropped. Not relief, exhaustion pretending to be relief. Julianne had learned the difference years ago, the way you learn to read weather in a house that never admits when it's storming. 41 days, he said, mostly to himself, mostly to the mirrored wall of the elevator. 41 days until the Kessler note comes due, and I still don't have the collateral to cover it. Julianne said nothing. She had learned that silence was safer than sympathy in these moments, and safer still than honesty. The truth sat inside her folio, typed in careful columns, verified against 3 separate ledgers she wasn't supposed to have access to. Sterling Holdings was $214 million in debt spread across 4 failed developments and 1 Miami tower that had been sitting half-finished for 11 months. The real numbers, the ones investors never saw, painted a company standing on a foundation already cracked straight through. The elevator opened onto the 40th floor. Sterling Tower's executive suite smelled like leather and cold coffee. Fluorescent light buzzing faint overhead, the kind of sound you stop noticing until it's the only thing left in a silent room. Arthur crossed the hallway, fast jacket already half off, tie loosened with 1 sharp tug. "Where's the deck?" he snapped. "On your desk." Julianne kept pace behind him, revised twice since Tuesday. Inside his office, floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline lit gold against a darkening sky. Arthur dropped into his chair, ran both hands through his hair, and stared at the folio for a long moment before opening it. He didn't see failure in these numbers. He never let himself. "The merger meeting is set," Julianne said. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock Sterling boardroom." And the chairman confirmed. Arthur's mouth curved, slow, satisfied, the first genuine smile he'd worn all night. Not the performance smile he'd used downstairs on Maya. Something older, hungrier, closer to what he actually was underneath the tailored suits and the charity galas and the $12,000 jackets. $500 million, he said, tapping the folio once. 500 million and this whole mess disappears. Nobody has to know how close we came. Nobody meant the board. Nobody meant the shareholders. Nobody meant the 300 employees whose pension fund had quietly been used as collateral. 8 months ago, a detail buried so deep in the paperwork that Arthur himself had almost forgotten it existed until Julianne found it during the March audit. She had never forgotten it, not for 1 single day since. Chairman Vance requested the full financial history, Julianne said carefully. Every subsidiary, every liability. Arthur waved a hand dismissive, already moving on. "Give him the clean version. The clean version doesn't include the pension fund." "Exactly." Julianne's fingers tightened around the folio's edge. She had built the clean version herself, 3 drafts each one, stripping out a little more truth until what remained looked like a healthy company, weathering a temporary storm instead of a house on fire with the doors locked from the inside. She hated how good she'd gotten at it. "You've met him before?" she asked. "Chairman Vance, once." Arthur leaned back, chair creaking under his weight. 15 years ago, some real estate summit in Geneva, quiet man, barely said a word the entire dinner. He shrugged, already dismissing the memory. Old money, older habits. These finance types love the theater of humility. Doesn't mean they're not just as hungry as the rest of us. Julianne said nothing to that either. She had read the chairman's file twice this week, every public record she could find, every filing with his name attached. Marcus Vance ran one of the last privately held investment firms in the country, a man who avoided cameras the way most billionaires chase them, whose signature on a bailout could resurrect a company or bury it in the same stroke of a pen. Nobody knew much else about him. Nobody knew what he looked like anymore. Not really, not since the last photograph on record was nearly a decade old. He's the last chip on the board, Arthur said, standing now, pacing toward the window. City lights stretched out below him, gold and endless, the same lights he'd built his entire identity on convincing people he owned. One signature, one meeting, that's all that stands between me and losing everything I've spent 30 years building. He said it like a man discussing whether not ruin. Julianne watched him standing there, backlit by a skyline that didn't belong to him nearly as much as he believed it did, and felt the folio grow heavier in her hands. Somewhere in that stack of numbers sat every lie Arthur Sterling had told to stay afloat. Somewhere in it sat every reason 300 families would lose their retirement if this merger collapsed the way it should. 9 o'clock. Arthur said again, mostly to himself, now rehearsing the tone he'd use tomorrow, arrogance already sliding back over his voice like a coat he'd never once taken off. Get the boardroom prepped. Best coffee, best view. I want him to see exactly what he's investing in. He had no idea what he was actually about to invite into that room. Julianne turned toward the door folio pressed tight against her chest, the true numbers hidden 3 pages beneath the ones Arthur would present tomorrow morning. She didn't know yet what she would do with what she knew. She only knew that somewhere out there, 41 days from ruin, a $500 million lifeline was arriving with a name attached that Arthur Sterling hadn't bothered to look at closely enough.
Security dragging her through the lobby. They tossed Maya Vance into freezing rain while Garrett Sterling stayed completely silent. If that were me, keeping composure would feel impossible. Imagine standing soaked while elites laugh. That breaks your spirit.
Maya was still in the lobby when Arthur found her again. She hadn't planned to linger. She'd called for her car 11 minutes ago and been told twice that the valet line was running behind. So she stood near the revolving doors, clutch in hand, watch catching the lobby light, waiting the way she'd waited through most of her life. Quietly, without complaint. Arthur crossed the lobby floor with Julianne trailing 2 steps behind his tie, retied his jacket back on his confidence fully restored after an hour upstairs, convincing himself the merger would save him. He saw Maya standing by the doors, and something in his face changed. Not surprise, opportunity. Still here. His voice carried across the marble loud enough for the front desk staff to hear, loud enough to draw 2 more heads from the concierge station. I thought I made myself clear downstairs. Maya didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the street outside, on the rain that had started sometime in the last hour, streaking sideways against the glass. I have a meeting in the morning that determines the future of this entire company, Arthur said, stepping closer. And I still have to deal with you cluttering up my lobby. He turned toward the front desk, toward the security guard stationed near the elevator bank, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit whose face never once shifted expression. Get her out. Julianne's grip on her folio tightened until her knuckles went pale. Sir, the guard said, hesitating for the first time all night. She's just waiting for her car. I don't care what she's waiting for. Arthur's voice dropped flat and final, the tone of a man who had stopped performing for an audience and started simply issuing instructions. Get her out of my hotel. The guard looked at Maya. She met his eyes without flinching, without pleading, without a single word that might have made this easier for him. Something about that stillness seemed to cost him more than her tears would have. He stepped forward anyway, his hand closed around her upper arm, firm, careful in a way that still managed to feel like violence. Maya didn't fight it. She let him guide her toward the door, chin-level, spine straight. The same posture she'd carried through an entire evening of being called a stray dog in front of 140 strangers. Man, this is the part that gets me every time. If that were me standing there getting dragged out into the rain, while the man who ruined my night watched from 6 feet away, I don't know if I could have kept it together the way she did. Imagine that. Imagine the audacity it takes to throw a woman out into a storm just to prove a point nobody asked you to make. The revolving door spat her out onto the front steps. Rain hit her immediately cold, relentless, soaking through the thin fabric of her $7 dress within seconds. The awning above the entrance offered no real shelter, just a narrow strip of dry concrete that the wind kept stealing away. Cars hissed past on the wet street. A doorman glanced her way once and then looked elsewhere the way people do when helping someone might cost them their job. Maya stood there. She didn't run for cover. She didn't call out. She simply stood, rain soaking her hair flat against her skull mascara she hadn't bothered wearing tonight, watch fogging slightly under the wet glass of its old crystal face. Behind the lobby doors, distorted through wet glass, she watched Arthur laugh at something Julianne said, though Julianne's face carried no matching humor at all. She watched Garrett appear in the lobby a moment later, scanning the room, spotting her through the glass, and then turning away toward the elevators without a single step toward the door. Not a flinch. Not a hesitation even. Just distance, the same distance he'd chosen back in the ballroom, now measured in inches of rain-soaked glass instead of feet of marble floor. Something in Maya's chest cracked, quiet, almost silent, the way ice does before it finally gives. She had absorbed insults for 3 years. She had absorbed Arthur's contempt. Garrett's silence, 100 small humiliations dressed up as family dinners and holiday parties and engagement celebrations that were never really about her at all. She had told herself over and over that dignity didn't require an audience to be real. Standing in the rain alone, watching the last person who was supposed to protect her walk toward an elevator instead of a door. She wasn't sure that was true anymore. For a moment, just a moment, she let herself feel the full weight of it. Not the cold, not the wet fabric clinging to her skin. The isolation underneath it, total absolute, the kind that makes a person wonder if standing your ground was ever worth the ground you lost, standing on it. If you want to see Arthur Sterling get exactly what he deserves, you already know what to do. Now back to Maya, soaked through alone on a curb that didn't care who she used to be. She looked down at her wrist. The old watch had survived worse than rain. 40 years of survival etched into its scratched crystal, into the soft leather strap worn thin by another hand long before it ever touched hers. She turned it once out of habit and felt something steady return to her chest, small, quiet, unbreakable. Not gone, not broken, just soaked. She reached into her clutch fingers, numb from the cold, and pulled out her phone. Water beaded across the screen as she wiped it against her sleeve, useless against rain that kept falling. She scrolled to a contact she hadn't called in 11 months. Not out of distance. Out of respect for a boundary, she'd set herself a promise not to lean on this number unless it truly mattered. Tonight, standing in freezing rain outside a hotel that bore her own last name on a building she'd never once mentioned owning, any part of it mattered. She pressed call. The line rang once, twice, and then picked up on the third ring. A voice on the other end, low and steady. The kind of voice that didn't need volume to command a room. Maya. Just her name. Nothing else. As the rain hit her face, Maya Vance began to speak, and somewhere across the city a phone call was quietly setting in motion the end of everything Arthur Sterling believed he still controlled. Julianne stayed behind long after the lobby emptied. She told the night manager she needed to finish tomorrow's boardroom prep. That much was true. She just didn't mention the second reason, the one sitting 3 floors up in a safe she'd watched Arthur open a dozen times without ever letting her see the combination. She knew it anyway. She'd watched his hands often enough to memorize the pattern. The executive floor was empty by 11 fluorescent lights buzzing overhead in a rhythm that used to fade into background noise. Tonight it sounded like a countdown. Julianne walked the hallway, slow folio pressed against her chest, heels silent against the carpet she'd normally crossed at a brisk, efficient pace. She stopped outside Arthur's office door. Her hand hovered over the keypad for 11 seconds before she typed the code. 6 digits. His daughter's birthday. A detail he'd mentioned once at a holiday party and never realized she'd filed away. The door clicked open. Julianne stepped inside, closed it behind her, and stood still for a moment in the dark, listening. Nothing. Just the hum of the city outside the window, rain still streaking the glass taxi horns bleeding faint through 40 floors of steel and concrete. She crossed to the painting. The Renoir swung open on its hinge without resistance, revealing the safe behind it, small, gray, unremarkable. Holding inside it the difference between 300 families keeping their pensions and 300 families losing everything they'd spent decades building. Her fingers shook, entering the combination. Not from cold, from 6 years of silence finally cracking open at once. She had told herself so many stories to justify staying quiet. She needed this job. Her mother's medical bills didn't pay themselves. Speaking up would cost her everything and change nothing because men like Arthur Sterling always found a way to bury the people who tried to expose them. Tonight, standing in his dark office with rain hammering the window, she couldn't remember why any of those reasons had ever felt bigger than what she was looking at. The safe opened with a soft click. Inside sat 3 folders, thick-tabbed, organized in Arthur's own meticulous handwriting. Julianne pulled them out one at a time, hands still trembling, and laid them across his desk under the glow of her phone's flashlight. The first folder held the pension fund transfers. $41 million moved 8 months ago into a shell account with no oversight, no board approval, no paper trail beyond the one she was currently holding. The second folder held the falsified audit reports, 3 signatures on each page, none of them belonging to anyone who had actually reviewed the numbers. The third folder held something she hadn't expected, a single sheet dated 14 years ago listing a private trust connected to a company called Vance Capital Partners. Attached to it a handwritten note in Arthur's own hand. Old debt, old grudge. Careful with this one. Julianne didn't understand what it meant yet. She photographed it anyway, along with every page in front of her, methodical now, her fear folding itself into something closer to purpose. Her phone's camera flash lit the dark office in short white bursts, 37 photographs in total, each one landing in a cloud folder she'd created 2 weeks ago and never told a single person about. When she finished, she returned every page to its folder, every folder to its exact position, inside the safe, closed the door, and swung the painting back into place with hands that had finally stopped shaking. She didn't feel brave. She felt like someone who had simply run out of room to keep pretending. Julianne left the building through the loading dock, the one exit without a security camera pointed directly at the door, and stepped out into the same rain that had soaked Maya an hour earlier. It hit her jacket in cold sheets, but she barely registered it. Her mind was already 3 steps ahead, running through a plan she hadn't known she had until she was standing in the middle of executing it. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd saved from Maya's staff intake form months ago, back when Maya had still worked catering events for the Sterling family before the engagement changed everything about her role in this building. Maya answered on the first ring, voice steady despite the rain still audible behind her. "It's Julianne." A pause, water dripping from her hair onto the phone screen. "I have something you need to see." 20 minutes later, they sat across from each other in an all-night diner 4 blocks from the Hotel Coffee. Cooling untouched between them, the flash drive sitting on the table like something radioactive. "I copied everything," Julianne said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, worn thin by adrenaline finally draining out of her system. The pension transfers. The falsified audits. Enough to end him. Maya turned the drive over once in her fingers, small, black, unremarkable, holding inside it the collapse of everything Arthur Sterling had built his empire on. "Why now?" Maya asked, not accusing, just asking. Julianne looked down at her coffee for a long moment before answering. "Because I watched him throw you out into the rain tonight, and I realized I've been standing in that same rain for 6 years. I just never called it that." She met Maya's eyes. "Somebody has to say something. It should have been me a long time ago. Not brave, just done pretending otherwise." Maya slid the drive into her clutch. Careful, deliberate, the same economy of motion she'd used to lift her watch off the marble lobby floor after Arthur had dropped it there like an insult. She looked up at Julianne with something that wasn't quite a smile closer to recognition. "There's a meeting tomorrow morning," Maya said. 9 o'clock, Sterling boardroom. Julianne's eyes widened slightly. "How did you know that?" Maya didn't answer right away. She reached for her phone instead, the screen still faintly damp from the rain, and typed a short message to a contact saved simply as Dad. She had no idea Julianne would think much later, looking back on this exact moment, that she was sitting across from the one person capable of ending Arthur Sterling in a single sentence. Maya set the phone down, glanced once more at the flash drive now sealed inside her clutch, and allowed herself for the first time all night something close to a smile. "Because he's going to be in that room too," she said. "And so am I." The boardroom at Sterling Tower smelled like fresh coffee and old ambition. Arthur arrived at 8:52, 8 minutes early. Blazer, buttoned hair combed back with the kind of precision that took a stylist 40 minutes to fake as effortless. He walked the room once before anyone else arrived, checking the water glasses, checking the skyline framed behind the head chair, checking every detail that might convince a stranger he wasn't drowning. Julianne arrived at 8:55, folio in hand, the clean version resting on top, the true version buried 3 floors below in a safe she'd already emptied of its secrets. By 8:58, 6 board members had filed in, murmuring low over coffee. None of them aware that the man across the table from them owed $214 million he had no real way to repay. At 9 o'clock exactly, the executive chair at the head of the table turned. It had been facing the window when everyone entered back to the room silent, since before any of them arrived. Nobody had questioned it. Chairmen were allowed their quirks, and Marcus Vance had built a reputation on being unreadable long before he'd built one on being rich. The chair completed its turn. Marcus Vance sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him, granite, calm gray eyes moving once around the room before settling on Arthur. Beside his folded hands sat something small, torn damp at the edges, a shredded check. $10,000 ripped into 8 pieces, reassembled into a rough approximation of its original shape on the polished table. Arthur's smile held for exactly 1 second longer than it should have. Chairman Vance. He extended a hand across the table, voice. Smooth, rehearsed the same tone he'd used on Maya 12 hours earlier when he'd called her a stray dog in front of 140 witnesses. "It's an honor." "Truly." Marcus didn't take the hand. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling." 2 words, flat, final. The room went quiet in a way conference rooms rarely do, the kind of silence that has weight pressing down on every chair around that table. Arthur lowered his hand slowly and sat, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before he buried it under practiced composure. "I understand you're here to discuss the merger," Arthur said, sliding the clean folio across the table, all $600 million of manufactured confidence riding on the next 10 minutes. "I think you'll find Sterling Holdings represents an exceptional opportunity." Marcus didn't open the folio. "Tell me about last night," he said instead. "The engagement dinner." Arthur's smile faltered just slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching before recovering. A minor family matter. Nothing relevant to today's business. Humor me. Julianne, standing near the boardroom door, felt her pulse climb. She hadn't told Arthur what she'd overheard through the walls last night, hadn't told him a single detail about who Maya Vance actually was, and watching Marcus Vance sit perfectly still across from a man who had no idea what was about to happen to him, she understood for the first time exactly why the folder in her hands mattered as much as it did. "There was a woman," Arthur said, choosing his words, now testing them before they left his mouth. "My son's fiancée. She showed up dressed inappropriately for the occasion, and I simply reminded her of certain standards, certain expectations we hold for people entering this family. You threw money at her feet," Arthur blinked. "I offered her financial assistance. You called her a stray dog." The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Arthur's jaw tightened, the polish cracking further, his voice losing the smoothness it had carried into the room only minutes earlier. "I don't see how a private family disagreement relates to a $500 million merger, Chairman Vance. You had her thrown out into the rain. She wouldn't leave when asked." Arthur's words came faster now, defensive, the rehearsed calm of 30 years finally starting to fray at the seams. "This whole thing is being blown out of proportion. She's nobody. A woman my son picked up somewhere, no name, no family, no family." Marcus repeated the words slowly, letting them sit in the air. "You're certain of that?" "Completely." Marcus reached into his jacket and set a photograph on the table, sliding it across the polished wood until it stopped in front of Arthur. Arthur looked down. The photograph showed Maya at age 9 standing beside Marcus outside a modest brick house, both of them smiling, his hand resting on her shoulder in the easy, unguarded way of a father who has never once needed to prove his love with money. Arthur stared at the image, his mouth opened. Nothing came out. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug, going the gray of old concrete, the blood retreating so fast Julianne could see it happen in real time from across the room. "That's my daughter," Marcus said. "Maya Vance. The woman you called a stray dog last night in front of 140 witnesses before throwing $10,000 at her feet like she was something to be bought off. Not negligence. A decision." Arthur's mouth worked once, twice no sound emerging. His hands folded moments ago in practiced confidence now sat frozen against the table, fingers pale around the edges of a folio. He suddenly understood held absolutely no weight in this room. There was no way I could have known. You didn't ask." Marcus's voice never rose. It didn't need to. "You saw a woman in a $7 dress and decided that told you everything worth knowing about her." Man, I don't know if I could sit still for this. There's a kind of quiet only someone who's finally been believed understands. Have you ever waited your whole life for someone to say those exact words on your behalf? Julianne watched Arthur's hands begin to tremble, small at first, then unmistakable, his entire practiced empire collapsing in real time under the weight of 2 photographs and 8 torn pieces of paper. "Chairman Vance," Arthur started again, voice cracking now, grammar fraying at the edges. "I think if we could just... There's context, you're not... The merger, it doesn't have to... The merger is dead." 3 words. The room absorbed them the way a building absorbs a foundation, giving out beneath it silent, total, no visible motion, yet everyone still waiting to feel the floor actually drop. "You knew your place." Arthur whispered the phrase, slipping out of him unintentionally, the same words he'd used on Maya 12 hours earlier, now aimed uselessly at a man who had never once needed to prove where he stood in any room he entered. Marcus's eyes didn't move off him. "No, Mr. Sterling, you did." Behind Arthur, unnoticed until this exact second, the boardroom door opened. Maya walked in. She wore a different dress tonight, still simple, still unadorned, the same scratched watch still resting on her wrist. She crossed the room without a word, stood beside her father's chair, and looked down at the man who had called her worthless in front of 140 strangers less than a day earlier. Arthur looked up at her. The girl he'd humiliated. The girl he'd thrown into the rain. The girl whose father held every remaining dollar of Sterling Holdings' survival in his folded granite calm hands. He had no idea until this exact moment exactly whose daughter he'd spent the last 12 hours destroying. No one in the boardroom moved for what felt like a full minute. Arthur sat frozen in his chair, hands still pressed flat against the polished table, staring at his own reflection in the wood grain like a man trying to recognize himself. The photograph of 9-year-old Maya still sat where Marcus had slid it 6 inches from Arthur's trembling fingers closer to him now than he wanted it to be. "This is a misunderstanding," Arthur said finally, voice thin, stripped of every ounce of polish he'd walked in wearing. "Chairman Vance, if we could speak privately." "There's nothing private left to discuss." Marcus rose from his chair unhurried and gestured once toward the door. Julianne stepped forward, folio in hand, the true version, now the one she'd carried through the rain last night. 37 photographs and 3 folders of proof that Sterling Holdings had been drowning for 8 months while its board sat in the dark. "Julianne Reyes has served as your executive assistant for 6 years, Marcus said, addressing the board, now his voice carrying without needing to rise. "Last night she discovered evidence of a $41 million pension fund transfer, unauthorized, unreported, hidden from every person in this room who trusted their retirement to this company." Julianne set the folio on the table. Her hands didn't shake this time. She opened it page by page, laying out the falsified audits, the shell account, transfers, the signatures that belonged to no one who had actually reviewed a single number inside them. 6 board members leaned forward at once, silence replaced by a low murmur of disbelief that grew sharper with every page. "You forged these," one board member said, staring at Arthur across the table. "You forged audit signatures." "I was protecting the company." Arthur said the words tumbling out fast, now ungoverned. "The market was volatile. I had a plan." "I always had a plan." "You had 300 employees' retirement savings sitting in a shell account with your name on the transfer authorization." The board member's voice cut through the room like a blade. "That's not a plan. That's fraud." Arthur's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Not defiance. Not denial. Just silence, the kind he had once mistaken for weakness in someone else, now sitting in his own chest like a stone. Maya stood beside her father's chair watch, catching the morning light through the boardroom window, and said nothing at all. She didn't need to. Every word Arthur had spoken last night, every sneer, every cruelty was already sitting on the table in Julianne's folio, cross-referenced against dates and dollar amounts that made his contempt look exactly as small as it had always been. "There's a morality clause in your employment contract," Marcus said, pulling a single sheet from his own briefcase and setting it beside the shredded check. "Section 14, fraud, financial misconduct, or conduct bringing the company into public disrepute voids all severance, all stock options, and all golden parachute provisions immediately upon board vote." "You can't." "The board can." Marcus looked around the table. "And will." 6 hands rose without hesitation. Arthur watched each one lift slow, deliberate, the sound of his entire empire folding in on itself in complete silence. No shouting, no dramatic gavel. Just 6 hands in the air and 30 years of built reputation collapsing like a building with its foundation pulled out from underneath it. "Effective immediately," Marcus said, "Arthur Sterling is removed as chief executive of Sterling Holdings. All assets tied to fraudulent transfers will be returned to the pension fund. All severance is voided under Section 14. Arthur stood so fast his chair scraped backward across the floor. "This is insane. 30 years. I built this company from nothing." "You built it on other people's money," Marcus said. "And you spent last night proving exactly what kind of man does that." Not a decision made in anger. A decision made with proof. Arthur's eyes found Maya's, desperate, now searching for something that might have been mercy in another man's face. He found none, just the same dead calm stare she'd given him in the ballroom 12 hours earlier, unchanged, unmoved. The watch on her wrist catching the light with a quiet dignity his $12,000 suit had never once earned. "You," he said, voice cracking around the word. "You did this." "No," Maya said. 5 words spaced evenly the same way she'd once told him she didn't need his money. "You did this yourself." Security arrived 4 minutes later. The same broad-shouldered guard from the lobby, blank expression unchanged, escorting Arthur Sterling out of the building he had spent 3 decades believing belonged to him. Rain still fell outside, steady now instead of driving, streaking the same glass doors he'd once had Maya drag through. He stepped out into it without an umbrella. No one moved to give him one. Julianne watched from the lobby window as Arthur stood on the curb, soaked within seconds, city traffic hissing past without slowing cars carrying people who had no idea they were watching the exact moment an empire finished dying. She felt something loosen in her chest. 6 years of silence finally exhaling all at once. Garrett arrived 20 minutes later, having heard everything secondhand from a board member's frantic phone call. He found Maya in the lobby, still standing beside her father, and stopped several feet away, uncertain now of what distance was even his to close anymore. "Maya, You already said everything you needed to," she said, echoing words from another rainy night, and turned toward the door without waiting for whatever apology he'd finally found the courage to attempt 11 hours too late to matter. Garrett didn't follow. Not because he'd finally learned, just because some doors once closed don't open twice for the same person. Julianne stepped outside a moment later and found Maya on the sidewalk, watch turned once against her wrist, rain finally slowing to something gentler than the storm from the night before. Maya reached out and took her hand, brief, steady, a gesture that needed no explanation. "Thank you," Maya said. "I should have said something years ago. You said something when it mattered. Some people spend an entire lifetime never once knowing what real power looks like. It isn't a title. It isn't a signature on a $500 million deal. Sometimes it's a woman standing still in the rain, refusing to kneel for anyone, waiting for the people who should have protected her to finally show her who they really were. This story is fiction, but that feeling standing alone while someone you trusted looks away instead of standing beside you, that's not fiction at all. I've watched people choose silence over courage more times than I'd like to admit, and it never stops being hard to watch. Have you ever waited for someone to defend you and realize the silence was your answer? Drop a comment. Like this, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more. Your worth was never something Arthur Sterling had the power to price. It was settled long before he ever opened his mouth.
Does society ignore invisible workers? This narrative is fiction, but systemic isolation remains real. I've watched cowards choose compliance over speaking up, which always hurts. Have you ever been abandoned by someone supposed to protect you? Hit subscribe for more karma.